So, thank you very much for being here today with us. It's a great delight and honor for us.
Happy to be here.
So, first things first. What is the role, in your opinion, of radical thought today?
The role of radical thought in any era needs to be to orient itself to trying to figure out, both in policy terms and in strategic organizing terms in society, how to transform the status quo in a way that leads to the equal distribution of social and political power, and to do so in a way that is not temporary, but is indeed historic. I don't know that it is different in that sense today than it has ever been. You could have said the same about ancient Greece, and you could have said the same about 19th century Greece, and you need to say the same in 21st century Greece. Of course, these social circumstances, the political circumstances, the geostrategic circumstances are different, and that means that the radical thought is not the same as it was in ancient Greece or in the 19th century. But the role and the purpose, I think, remains the same. In the current conjuncture, certainly, given the obvious failure of radical thought associated with not only the communist movement through the 20th century, but also the social democratic movement. And you could even say today, with the rise of Trumpism, the liberal democratic movement, the role of radical thought is to overcome the way in which the previous failures of liberal democracy, social democracy, and communism have left societies open to this xenophobic moment that the world is heading in. So our responsibilities are enormous today in this respect. It used to be said in the 1930s by some radical thinkers that those who speak of fascism and don't speak of capitalism should remain silent. And it is perhaps the case today that those who speak of capitalism and don't speak of fascism should remain silent.
On your lecture yesterday, you talked about this notion of the promise of democracy. So I was wondering if you could summarize in a few words the main argument of what you're thinking about it.
Yes, I'd be happy to. I fell in love with Greece when I first came here 39 years ago. I felt that I had come home, even though I was born in Winnipeg, Canada. And I think it had something to do with the garlic in the skwirdalia. It had something to do with the fact that I drive my car in the kind of crazy way that Athenians drive their cars. But it had to do with the politicization of everyday life, by which I don't mean in a negative sense. I mean the enthusiasm with which people were discussing political issues. Ordinary people, in the restaurants, in the bars, etc. And I think that was associated, of course, with a long tradition in Greece, but it had to do with the promise of democracy in the late 1970s, coming out of the dictatorship. And I think that the enthusiasm for joining the European Union, which was widely shared on most of the left and most of the right, had to do with guaranteeing that promise of democracy. The feeling that being part of Europe would allow not only the Greeks to realize Greek civilization's contribution to the West, etc., but would guarantee democracy in Greece. And 40 years on, what we have seen since the beginning of the Euro crisis is the stifling of democracy in Greece through the appointment, first of all, of a technocratic government with an economist from the European Union, the ECB, the European Central Bank, imposed upon the Greek people. He happened to be Greek, but his qualifications was that he was an economist with the European Central Bank. And then, of course, most obviously, not only the memoranda imposed upon both the PASOK and the New Democracy governments, but in 2015, it imposed upon the radical left. In the face of a referendum, moreover, not only an election, where the government was, in a sense, calling democracy on the European Union. They were saying, no, we're not just a bunch of crazy communists. We have the people behind us, and democracy presumably matters to the European Union. And far from that impressing them, this enraged them. What do you mean you're calling democracy on us, right? You're not part of our project if you're doing that. So in that sense, I think the promise of democracy is, I don't mean this in some vague way. I'm thinking of it very concretely, historically, in relation to the Greek experience since the dictatorship, up to today. And what struck me about something I just happened to come across as I was thinking about this lecture was that it's often thought that it is expertise that stifles democracy, that it's the knowledge of the technocrats. It's knowledge against, in a sense, the sentiments of the people that stifles democracy. And I came across an interesting book by a man called, a classicist, called Pauline Ismail, called Democracy Slaves. And it's really the major study of the role that the slaves that were owned by the polis, directly owned by the city of Athens, played in ancient Greek democracy. And he argues that they served the function, of course, they controlled the currency, they oversaw elections, they kept public records, etc. And he argues that what that did was it broke the legitimacy of the ruling families, of the landed aristocracy, who could claim that we are the only ones who have the knowledge to be able to run a government, to run a state. We run our household in the broad sense, yes? We have the knowledge to run a state. And by vesting that in slaves, who by definition cannot make autonomous decisions, cannot be authority, yes, it allowed the claim to be made by the landless masses, by the indigent artisans, as he calls it. It allowed them to make the claim that there's a different type of knowledge, that there's a horizontal knowledge secured through political deliberation, right? And that in that sense, you could leave the technical aspects of the civil services, you like, to do what's needed in terms of expertise, but not vest responsibility in it as political authority for decision-making, right? He then turns around and says, imagine if the Europeans, is in his conclusion, if the European Central Bank was run by slaves and they introduced bad policies, we could either sell them or we could whip them, we could flog them, yes? And it's a fascinating idea, but of course he's wrong. The ECB's policies imposed upon Greek democracy were not a matter of technocratic power. On the contrary, the real authority that was doing this was this entirely informal gathering of finance ministers who are parts of elected governments. And they they forced this upon Greece for base political reasons that had to do with their election and re-election. Part of this is very ugly. Part of it, I think, is prejudice, equivalent to what we call racism in North America. You know, most people don't claim to be racist against blacks. They just think that black people happen to be lazy and they don't want their taxes going for single mothers on welfare. Well, in a similar way, in Northern Europe, there is a prejudice that people in Southern Europe are lazy, even though they work far more hours than do people in Northern Europe. So there was that prejudice that was being pandered to, and it took the form of this hostility, I think, to the Greek attempt to get out from the crisis, the genuine crisis, in a radical way. But there was also, of course, the fact that it is an illusion to think that Europe is governed by the technocrats in Brussels. The center of gravity in Europe are the individual nation states. The power of those individual nation states are very asymmetric. It has been the German government's policy as the most powerful of those nation states inside the European Union, not to be responsible for the debts of other member states from the beginning. You could say this goes back to the Treaty of Rome, but certainly from the Economic and Monetary Union moment on. That partly has to do with the prejudice, which I think even the German working class that is organized in the Social Democratic Union movement, etc., carries. But that has partly to do with this as well. I think it was base political reasons. And above all, of course, it was the power of international finance. Most of the money that went to Greece was recycled back to German and French banks. And all states in the world today are dependent upon, for their revenues and their legitimacy, on successful capital accumulation. And because we're living in a financialized capitalism, this has, of course, an enormous effect on every state. So it isn't a matter, as Varoufakis believed, if you go back and read his Global Minotaur, or even as Euclid Tsakalatos believed, and if you read his book before Syriza was elected, they could go in and show that the neoliberal economists who were giving advice to the finance ministers were wrong, that this was bad expertise, that they had good expertise. And this was naive, I think. And the point of going back to this argument about the role of slaves in ancient democracy is really to say this is a misreading of the current situation. This was the argument I was making, and it ended with the punchline that the tragedy of the frustrated promise of democracy is that it takes the form of the tragedy of Syriza and government. Which is a tragedy, I think, for the left around the world. Because it was only in Greece, in the whole world, that out of the fourth great crisis of capitalism, the first great capitalist crisis of the 21st century, only in this country, only here, was a radical left government elected. Nowhere else. And the tragedy of Syriza's inability to transcend the enormous limits that any government would face, the frustration of its promise, is a burden, I think, that the international radical left needs to bear. Not least because we gave insufficient solidarity, but for much greater reasons in terms of, this goes back to your first question, what is the role of radical thought?
This is connected also with my last question, but not least, regarding your new book. I would like to ask what is the core aim of the book on the one hand, and on the other hand, if you remain optimistic about the socialist challenge today.
The book comes out of a long essay that I wrote with Sam Gindin in the volume of the Socialist Register, the 2017 volume called Rethinking Revolution. So we try to approach the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, not by looking back on it, but by issuing a challenge to the left to rethink revolution today. And that's for the most part what we did. And Sam and I had an essay in it called, Sam Gindin and I had an essay in it called Class Party and the Challenge of State Transformation. And it tried to put that challenge in the context of the failure, as I said before, out of the mass parties that emerged out of working class formation between 1880 and 1920, their failure, as I said, both as social democratic and as communist movements. And that failure both had to do with not developing the capacities of the people that they organized to, in fact, be effective Democrats, but also their failure to engage in state transformation. The whole notion of smashing the state in the Bolshevik discourse is, of course, absurd. You don't take a hammer and smash buildings. You have to find a way to transform the state apparatus that facilitates the distribution of power as well as resources. And, that failure was encapsulated, as we say in that book, by a Soviet worker that Sam and I met, an elderly worker in 1990 in Togliatti, where the auto industry is in Russia, who said since 1924 we were made into fools. We weren't just fooled, we were made into fools, yes? Our capacities were lost, and the whole promise of the socialist movement was that it would develop working class people's capacities, ordinary people's capacities. We see the failure of that in what Plato called the regime of ignoramuses. Democracy is the regime of ignoramuses, and that's what we have with Trump today. We have workers who voted, working class communities who voted Democrat since the New Deal in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Iowa, etc., without fail, yes, voting for Trump. And this is a reflection of the bankruptcy of a party politics that was based in working class communities. And it did nothing to develop their capacities. On the contrary. It not only, of course, did terrible social effects on those communities through the neoliberal response to the crisis of the 70s, etc., but it actually did an undoing of popular capacities, of democratic capacities. So the book and the article that we wrote in 2017 then says, but of course history doesn't end. And political thought doesn't end. And the second chapter is about the kind of thinking that was done from the 1960s and 70s on, not least by the great Greek political thinker Nikos Poulantzas, to take us beyond the failures of communism and social democracy. He didn't find a recipe, but he had some important insights along with others. And we tried to provide in that second chapter a mapping of that new generation of radical thought, which was coming out of that failure already. And then we admit that that generation, which is in a sense my generation, although Poulantzas was 10 years older than me, 20 years older than me, but that we were unable to construct political alternatives to the communist and social democratic parties. Many of us went off to try to form better Leninist parties. Others became anarchists, giving up on parties altogether, and were engaged in the creative protest against globalization and so on. But what has happened in the last 15 years is a shift from protest to politics, and an understanding that one had to go beyond the Bolshevik model as an alternative to the failure of Stalinism and social democracy. And it's a remarkable development of which Syriza represented perhaps most creatively in the world. So it then attempts to look at the Syriza moment and identifies the problem in what we've really been talking about, that as Syriza did embed itself in the solidarity networks, in the protests, etc., and would manage to transform that into an orientation to you can't change the world without changing the state. It became so concerned with expertise. It became so concerned to show that, and indeed not just to show, to actually be a party which would be able to bring the honest, capable, knowledgeable people with it into the state. So it wouldn't be trapped as PASOK was and reproduce a clientelist state. And it became so concerned with that the role that it was beginning to play, not nearly well enough, of being a creative agent of class formation in a new way when classes are so disorganized, so individualized, yes? So precarized, that you can't hardly speak of people having any social power as groups anymore, yes? And it was playing a role as an organizer in that respect, and a creative one, not in the sense of trying to create the old proletariat, not reliant on it, but engaged in a new process of formation. That was set aside. And the tragedy of it, I think, is what we see. Now the question this doesn't end. It hasn't ended here in Greece. I think the struggle in that sense will still continue. And you could see it emerging in the most surprising of places. In the American Democratic Party, right? With Sanders. I spent most of my academic writing trying to prove that you could not change the Labour Party into a socialist party. And then suddenly, someone I've known from the 1970s as a young follower of Tony Benn, who I admired greatly and knew well and wrote about, etc., he reemerges out of this marginal little group, the campaign group in the British Labour Party, to become leader of the Labour Party. And in a way that generates, moreover, a new group of activists, organizers around this group now called Momentum, which is the catalyst for over 300,000 people, most of them young, and indeed remarkably young working class people, joining the Labour Party or voting for it. So the book, in its final two chapters, tries to look at that phenomenon and its limits and contradictions, not to, in any sense, try to market it, but to try to examine the limitations that it faces in its own capacities as well as externally. That's what the book is essentially doing. Yeah.
And in your view, what do you think can be done to actually eliminate a bit the gap between radical thought and actual political practice? There is all this discussion about how academics have actually secured themselves behind the walls of universities, and radical thought is being written and produced today, but where is the actual practical aspect of it?
You asked me earlier about whether I was optimistic.
Yes.
I think Gramsci was wrong to appropriate that slogan, optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect. I think it's exactly the opposite. I think we have to be pessimistic about voluntarism. I think that the optimism of the intellect lies in our capacity to try to think through and map in a strategic way how to, as I was saying before, engage in the type of new class formation which will develop people's intellectual capacities, so that you don't have this divorce between the university and the activist on the street. That I think in this sense, Gramsci was of course right. That he had an image of the modern prince as the mass political party whose main goal it is to turn the ordinary party member into an intellectual, one who is not waiting for Apulanzas to come along and tell him how to vote, but is actually active. Now, without pretending that we'll overcome the division of labor in this respect, I don't want to be naive. But there is nevertheless a difference between the type of activist, the type of party member, the type of union member, the type of professional teachers association member who can walk into a meeting and actively engage in a discussion with an intellectual. Yes, someone who is defined as having that position in society, in a way that is knowledgeable, in a way that is genuinely engaged and to some extent egalitarian. That has happened in the past. Part of the successes of not only socialist parties was that there were moments at which that was created. I think you could even see it in certain parties that were liberal. And I think that's our task. So I'm not naively optimistic. But insofar as it's not worth living unless you try to change the world, I am optimistic about the capacity of the intellect that everyone has, and about that intellect to be mapping a way forward in terms of changing the world. We won't do it through will alone. We won't do it through just the spirit of revolution. We will only be able to be optimists if we have some confidence that we have the broad intellect to be able to map a strategic way forward.
So thank you very much for all your remarks and your ideas. They were really interesting. So thank you.
Glad to be here. Good luck with your new alternative group.
We will need it. Thank you.